When do you distinguish an antagonist from a villain? There are many different ways in which a character can be defined, and often most times the examples are rigid definitions that don't really fit a wide variety of different actual examples. An antagonist's only requirement is that they oppose or halt the hero in some way during the story from achieving their goal. That's it. They don't even have to be bad people. They could be a good-meaning coworker in a comedy movie. Just that one guy at the office you can't stand. But there's no reason for you not to. Of course, there are various reasons that one would use an antagonist over a villain. But even so, this definition is too broad. There's too many characters that are just antagonists. We can't analyze a certain trope or subsect or really even a vibe they give off, because the only requirement is that they are just different from the hero. But a villain, to me, a villain is more interesting, and we can actually analyze them, and we can know when we've deviated a little too far. But first, when we talk about villains, we have to understand why they're a villain. What's the difference between that and an antagonist? Well, a villain is supposed to be bad, is supposed to be evil, do wrong things for the wrong reasons. What is bad? What is wrong? Is evil something we can even define, be objective about? What happens when morality is different? I'm getting ahead of myself. What is evil? First and foremost, evil is broadly defined as wicked and immoral. There are various ways to use this definition, but it's broad, unspecific, and it's tied to a lot of supernatural or religious contexts that I personally can't get my head around, because oftentimes you can't really use them to describe a villain, at least a narrative context, or at least not outright. When you have a character that is devoid of those concepts, how do you define something that is not portraying what it means to be evil for a lot of people? Well, the simple answer is that you do it anyway. You see, just because evil is a moral, religious, supernatural concept that we made up to make sense of things, doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't such a thing. Of course, I cannot guarantee that you will understand this video in the way that you or I even understand it. There is no objective evil. Everyone's beliefs, individually, religiously, they will all have a difference to them, and I cannot guarantee that you will get out of this video what anybody else will get out of this video, and for that I apologize, but this is why we discuss these things, to better understand each other and the stories we tell. Because evil is based on something that is immoral, as in the absence or direct opposition to something that is moral, well, morality you can't really define because of these ties. Of course, there is religious contexts, types of people, like their personality, there's historical figures and differences in historical context, and there's always that one guy who comes around and says the music is too loud in the middle of the day, even though you haven't been blasting it. Still getting over that one. Or the people who interrupt you in a conversation. These evils are mostly subjective. So that we are not here philosophizing all day, we need to at least pin down what morality we are basing our evil off of today. We cannot sit here forever. For now, the easiest, most broad definition we can get, so that we mostly all agree, it is that evil is the opposition to the objective moral good that the human race should be able to survive and flourish, thrive in the easiest, most peaceful way possible. This could be for the individual, for the greater collective. It could be for the collective of the species, the immediate family, friend group, the planet they inhabit, the other beings on said planet. But mostly it is to survive and flourish. This is the natural driving factor that is the most familiar to us, and it is one that we can almost certainly all agree on, because it is driven into our very biology. Regardless of the extra morals that we place on top of that, that is generally what we seek in our morality. Evil must be in opposition to that. Now we can get somewhat of a cleaner, more clear picture of what a villain is. This is where we get our Darth Vaders, Harkonnens, our Bond villains, Sauron, the Joker, Ganon. These are all people who murder, torture, scheme, do anything they can to make a super weapon or take over the world. Sometimes mercilessly, thoughtlessly kill just because they can, because they have the power and the, in their eyes, right to do so. These, the ones I've just mentioned, are usually what we think of when we think of villains, our comic book villains, our, well, people in our media that we use as a portrayal of those that are evil. The, I won't say cardboard cutouts, but the windows into the soul of the people who we despise, disagree with the most. And that's all well and good, but there's something about the villain, about this immoral person, where the true nuance to them isn't necessarily about who they are, but about what they believe. This is where we like to, as an audience and as writers, like to get into the nitty-gritty of what this person thinks, about how they act, about who they choose to do right by and who they don't. What does it say about them, and what does it say about us in reaction? What does it say about the world they inhabit? And what does it say, kind of, about the writer's beliefs about the world? Is there more interesting things than a villain? What happens when a villain isn't so immoral, but more so a protagonist in their own story? I mean, that is usually what we think of anyway. The antagonist to the antagonist is, well, the protagonist. They are attempting to uphold the same moral principle, but it is at the odds, at the seams, that they fight, they bicker, they battle, and they discuss how these things should go about. Usually we like to contextualize the villain as flawed or morally corrupt, or, well, we might describe this kind of villain as more of an anti-hero, just a different shade of gray. An anti-hero is, well, in the comic book world where the term was coined, somebody who is pretty much a hero, fights with the heroes, but has sort of an edge to them, has sort of a bad side, does things the wrong way, but ultimately does it for the greater good. Morally corrupt to themselves, but in terms of the world, just a greasy, rusty cog in the machine of world police? Something like that. These characters are morally complex, and they have staying power. These are the characters that we find ourselves agreeing with, but are kind of put off by because of their morally complex and sometimes corrupt methods and ideals. They may not always be doing it for the right reasons, but they are helpful to the cause anyway. One character that might really be the most right, but also the most morally corrupt, is the Punisher, Frank Castle. It's one of the best textbook anti-heroes that pretty much anybody has ever created. When I talked about anti-heroes for the first time, you probably pictured the Punisher just by osmosis. you may not even know much about him besides he's got the skull and he's got guns, and too many Republicans have them as a bumper sticker, but I digress. In the world of comics especially, killing is sort of seen as a last resort, the last-ditch effort before everything has to go bad, before we have to question whether our hero really did everything they could. And sometimes they couldn't. What do you do with a character who thinks that's the first resort? And that's pretty much the only difference. Somebody who will kill on sight will even do so preventatively, so that crimes are not done in the future. A Batman may have a no-kill rule and outright refuse to kill genocidal maniacs, and that might be going too far. And there's interesting depths to a story like that, where Batman's psyche is the cause of the story, the point of which is, does Batman's no-kill rule get in the way of justice more so than not?
If it had been you that he'd beat to a bloody pulp, if he had taken you from this world, I would have done nothing but search the planet for this pathetic pile of evil death-worshipping garbage and send him off to hell.
You don't understand. I don't think you've ever understood.
What? What, your moral code just won't allow for that? It's too hard to cross that line?
No! God almighty, no! It'd be too damned easy. All I've ever wanted to do is kill him. A day doesn't go by when I don't think about subjecting him to every horrendous torture he's dealt out to others, and then end him.
Aw, so you do think about me.
But if I do that, if I allow myself to go down into that place, I'll never come back.
Why? I'm not talking about killing Penguin or Scarecrow or Dent. I'm talking about him. Just him. And doing it because he took me away from you.
I can't. I'm sorry.
So I have a small extra point I just want to put about this scene right here that is part of this problem as well, is that Batman is specifically saying he can't, partially because he thinks he'll go insane, and there's like his psyche stuff there, and that is interesting. It is interesting to have a struggle with a villain like that. But also, there's something to be said about the moral quality of, just because somebody is worse doesn't mean it is better to kill them. And I think that's kind of what he's saying. Like, he can't make any exceptions. It doesn't matter if there's a difference between 500,000 people killed and one. To him, they are equal weight. You have done no less wrong. And I think we also kind of think about that way of like, there is a difference between one person killed and 20, but somewhere after 20, the number gets too big. It's just like, well, it doesn't matter if you've killed 1 million or 10,000. At what point do we say that they're all kind of equally the same? I think that's an interesting moral distinction, and there's like some gray area there, but at the end of the day, and I will make this point, I think, later, is that the amount of people does matter, but not as much when we talk about the moral of the person to snuff out evil or to reprimand it, to rehabilitate it. So, back to the video. But the Punisher takes that and flips it. Is it actually morally correct to kill first and not ask questions? In the world of comics and in the interest of mass media, Frank often undermines this point himself. He often compares himself to a monster, a guy who is saving his last bullet for himself, which, commendable, sure, and maybe he's right. Well, in the real world, the Punisher is not very morally correct. like at all. He does not wait for a jury of peers. He does not kill people in prison. He does not wait for a sentence or a charge to be pressed. No, he gets evidence for himself. He loads a gun, or 3, or 17, and then he drives out, stalks the victim, and kills him, basically with no other questions being asked. He might work on his abs for a day just so that a man can punch him in the stomach, basically steal, and then just cower in fear before he beats the ever-living shit out of him and maybe kills him right there. Frank is not alright in the head. He is clearly a serial killer with a vendetta against criminals. He is not mentally well. Of course, the Punisher TV show goes into more of this, and so do the comics, but the thing about it is that in our world, a Frank Castle cannot exist. He is too morally corrupt. He kills. He is guilty until proven innocent. That is his MO. That is what he's always been. But do we disagree with who he deems immoral? And what happens when he deems someone immoral that the rest of us don't agree, or somebody that the justice system screwed over? Does Frank take into consideration false confessions? Does he wait till all the evidence is out before he goes out and kills somebody? If Frank were alive in the real world, he probably wouldn't. He'd probably just hear about a guy who got arrested and then probably go find him and kill him. Or just hear a rumor and then kind of not really care what it was. If any moral act, if anybody was put into question, he would just shoot, and that would be the end of that. But we cannot operate in this way, not for all of us, at the very least. Some of us might reserve the right that death is the only option, and if anybody has ever been accused of such a thing, well, good riddance. But then there's false accusations and we can't really tell, so maybe it's not quite the same thing. But let's say that Frank Castle literally only kills people who have been sentenced, we all agree deserve to die for some reason, like somebody, and will...
They not like us. They not like us. They not like us.
And will just say that he's basically the death penalty. Instead of a doctor coming in with euthanization, then we just sick Frank on him. Who knows? Maybe he'll get a little fun out of the torture. Maybe they'll feel the pain they've done to others. Maybe... oh, wow. But is the death penalty even correct anyway? Most states don't even have it as an option. It's barely on the edge of moral corruptibility. I mean, to kill somebody who is a killer, is that right? Is Batman right? Is it you kill a murderer, you don't leave the world with any less murderers? Is that really somebody we want to be? Maybe. There's certainly not much else we can do with them. We can send them to prison and slave labor for the rest of their lives. We could put them on house arrest and have guns trained on them at all times. We could kill them. And what else do we do? Is it so much so that our society is built this way that we can't really think of any other option? Or have we always just wanted a way out? Maybe Frank is doing the right thing. Maybe he's making the hard choices that nobody else can. Get rid of him before we fill up our prisons with horrible people and risk them getting away. We don't want a mass murderer on the loose. Not in my backyard. We don't want anybody dangerous living around us. We want them somewhere else, away, so they can't hurt us or the people we care about anymore. But that's the thing. Where do we put them? If not in a hole in the ground. Do we bury them underneath the prison? Is prison even moral? Besides the long history of the U.S. prison industrial complex, which is a mouthful, by the way, the institution being a glorified reinvention of the slave trade, in a grander scale, prisons may not be really moral at all. Disregarding solitary confinement as literally one of the worst things you could possibly do to a person, there are dangers even when it comes to the most basic imbalance of power. This is where we usually talk about the Stanford prison experiment, it's usually rearing its ugly head from a Vsauce video somewhere. Vsauce honestly explained it better and did it in a longer format, and I really don't want to go into the weeds of this, but it is something to mention, so I will link that video down below if you are interested. It's honestly a really good video, you should watch it. But the Stanford prison experiment, in the most uncertain terms possible, is when psychologist Philip Zimbardo gathered two groups of seemingly random, he put an ad in a newspaper, I'm pretty sure, for this prison experiment. One group of boys would be guards, one group of boys would be prisoners, and for however long, they would see what it would be like if the job of guard and the job of prisoner were to, on seemingly ordinary people, would that change how their psychology worked? Would their behavior match the stereotype? Would they engage in terrible behavior? Could you make somebody evil just by telling them to do their job? Which we already kind of know the answer to that, right? The Nazis, huh? Of course, we also already know the answer to that. Maybe not at the time, but if you tell somebody that is the enemy, these people are lesser than you, you're probably not gonna treat them as an equal. Unless your willpower and moral incorruptibility is way higher than most of us, you will probably fall, and this experiment kind of shows that. Honestly, the experiment was so bad that it was cut short. Of course, there were problems with the study. No study is 100% perfect, but it is a pretty accurate representation, as we already know, in modern times more now than ever, about police not really being the arbiters of truth, justice, and the American way. Well, maybe that last part, but we don't have to get into that. So, that leaves us with seemingly no other option, right? There's no justice in killing, vaguely. There's no justice in prisons. So, what do we have? Rehabilitation? Well, yeah, probably. That's probably the best way to go about it. But what do we do with those who aren't rehabilitatable? Do we just throw them in prison? Do we kill them? I'm not going to attempt to know the answer to this question, but it's something that we can throw a character onto. This arbiter of moral incorruptibility that makes the hard decisions for us so we don't have to solve them. It honestly is what makes the Punisher so interesting, is that when you get down to the crux of that issue, he's right. There is nothing to do with them. Might as well end their suffering and the suffering of others before either party suffers anymore. Leave one person to be truly evil for the benefit of all. It's kind of a Jesus allegory if you think about it, except if Jesus had a gun. Maybe it's not really that much of a Jesus allegory. But anyway, the scapegoat thing aside, we just don't know exactly what the answer is, and I will not pretend to know what that is either. On an individual level, this seems like it might be worth it. On a collective level, it's way, way, way easier. This is what I mean when I mean that even in the context of an objective moral framework, it depends on what perspective you have to look at it from, because ultimately, different levels are going to require different levels of thought, and there is no one right way to go about this, unless you literally surveyed everybody and got literally the best possible answer. We can kind of intuit what the answer will be, but we're not perfect. On the individual level, it's wrong to kill, so you shouldn't kill. On the collective survival of the species route, killing a mass murderer is easy. You just do it. There's really no reason not to. Then the next question is that on the individual level, who pulls the trigger? Who kills the killers? The answer is Frank Castle. As we talk about morals on the collective level, it's part time that we get to another villain And I mean a real villain with this one. There is no anti-hero here. This man is morally corrupt in basically every way possible. When it comes to the collective, there is none more divisive and well known than Thanos. For a villain like the MCU's Thanos, where from a certain perspective he is compelling and reason enough to sympathize with, even on some level agree with, the question of the death penalty or execution without trial becomes increasingly harder to take seriously. Thanos is an alien from the planet Titan, the sole survivor of an entire planet being wiped out in a mass famine. It's not exactly stated, but it's implied that's the famine. Presumably destroying every living thing on it due to overpopulation and the exploitation of every possible resource his people had access to. With this trauma, a messiah complex, and the flawed belief that the solution is to wipe out half of all life, he forges the Infinity Gauntlet, or gets a dwarf to do it for him, but a thing capable of holding the Infinity Stones, which, when together, have the power to reshape all of reality with the snap of his fingers. With this, it is the perfect weapon. He can destroy half of all life in the universe all at once. Thanos tries to remedy and justify this plan with various arguments, which all sound reasonable in the moment, but ultimately we as a species are uncomfortable with a solution like this, with mass genocide. Thanos assures us it is not based on any discrimination, that it is completely random, which that in and of itself has issues, but it doesn't really matter to us on how moral the argument seems from a utilitarian perspective, because he's still planning to genocide everything and everyone, or at least half of it. In this instance, it's not hard to say we have to kill him before he kills everyone else. So, it seems that if the threat is big enough, our collective morality to not kill our fellow sapient beings tends to falter, as if to say, this time, it's okay. The word villain originates in Latin, where the word villainous, I think that's how you pronounce it, was just a word to describe someone who lived in a villa, which is just a villager. The aristocracy of the Middle Ages in Old French and Anglo-Saxon society used this word to describe a villager as someone with uncouth mind and manners, which goes to show that the rich suck and always have. With this association and the rising belief that good manners, and thus being civilized, whatever that meant, were a measure of how good of a person you were, the term that once meant villager became one of describing a bad person, which is also still a villager in some cases. As these ideas strengthen and history moves on, we find the term drifting from describing simply a person who doesn't raise their pinky when drinking to describing a scoundrel or a criminal, a person who commits morally reprehensible actions. Which is just in time for our good old boy Bill Shakespeare to come crashing into history in the English-speaking world with so much force he'll be paying back the damages on the property for the rest of his life. During the 14 and 1500s, a type of play called a morality play was en vogue, in which characters were personifications of their moral qualities. And the story was, as the name suggests, to promote some kind of moral. One of these stock character types was named the Vice, which was originally given to a character by playwright John Haywood in 1532, who represented the devilish tempter, who attempted to corrupt humanity in direct opposition to the objectively morally good concepts like charity, for example. When Shakespeare gets to writing his plays, he takes the idea of the Vice character, this evil personification, and infuses its identity with the much more complex human characters in his plays. In this way, he creates the modern idea of the villain as a character trope, someone with moral failings who tries to oppose, corrupt, or outright kill the hero of the story. Simple. It is, however, difficult to talk about the history of the villain without talking about religion, prejudice, and oppression. With the development of the English language and the history of plays in Europe, we must talk about the role that Christianity plays in both its histories. The Catholic Church was, for a very long time, the sole authority on the ability to read and write. Most often, it was the local friar or monk who were able to, most citizens going to church without being able to read the Bible, which of course led to corruption, as humans tend to do. When Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses to the door of All Saints Church in Wittenberg, Germany in 1517, he was opposing the moral corruption of the Roman Catholic Church, which was practically the only Christian sect in Europe at the time. He was opposing the practice of indulgences, among other things. This practice was predicated on the fact that you could buy your way into heaven, equating the money earned and given to your local priest as a confession, which only lasted so long because the uneducated public could not read the Bible and thus could not understand that this was not one of the tenets of their religion. Starting the Protestant Reformation nearly single-handedly aside, the history of plays also plays a part in this. Which, side note, while I was making this video, I had met coffee with a friend. I grew up Catholic. He told me in Christianity that is not Roman Catholic, there's a thing called tithing, which is like giving 10% of your income to the church, which, by the way, isn't a thing. That's not true. It's not in the Bible. There's no source saying that you have to do that. I don't want to do anything like anybody's beliefs, but I'm just saying that's not a thing. That's not, people are lying to you. If your priest is making you tithe, he probably just wants money. Anyway, back to the video. For a long time in Europe's history, the only music or performance that was allowed to be performed were those at church or those with the express approval of the Catholic Church, which of course tended to be those that upheld the beliefs of the religion. This iron grip on theater was upheld from 500 AD to 1558 when the Protestant Reformation hit England, and Queen Elizabeth I banned all religious plays, thus giving way to the Elizabethan era of theater. With 1,000 years of restrictions, the Catholic Church, and thus the mortals thereof, most certainly had an influence on the populace of Europe. Of course, Christianity did not go away. Surprise, surprise. There was just now an Anglicized church in England that still upheld most of the moral beliefs of the religion, but of course the practices and governance of the institution had changed. In Shakespeare's work, as complex as these characters are, they are subject to the morals of its creator. So, most of these plays, if not all of them, have the influence of the Christian lens, and thus the morals of the characters and the play's narrative itself are based on that framework. In the Christian context, evil is defined by the opposition and disobedience of God's word, which can further be described by the moral character of the devil, Satan, God's great adversary, the great tempter, the ruler of hell, is everything opposite to the omnibenevolent God. For Christianity, the devil is the embodiment of evil itself. It is in the name, literally, evil. That's it. Whatever he does defines what it is like to be evil. Thankfully, the Christian framework of morality is pretty in line with our intuitive idea about what constitutes good and evil and what we've been discussing today. However, like we saw with pre-Protestant Reformation, this moral framework can be manipulated, obscured, corrupted, and used for evil purposes. If you are made to believe that something is in the Bible when it actually isn't, either words expressly written or an interpretation of words that do in fact exist, and then evil acts are committed on those beliefs, that it is God's will, one of two things occurs. Either your false belief is called out, stopped, and you are reprimanded and punished for committing these evil acts that you never should have in the first place. Or you are so successful in changing the minds of others that many believe that your interpretation must be what God meant, thus on some level changing the framework of moral belief in the followers of the church. The zealotry of course is not exclusive to religious peoples, and of course the method of swaying the opinions of the public is not a power solely reserved to the leaders of the church. Anybody, given enough spread of an idea said with confidence, can change many people's minds. Tying back into Thanos, this is actually where we see the various people who make the argument that Thanos, despite his mass genocide, actually believe he was right. It's not that his moral beliefs are any better or well-crafted than the next supervillain, but he had a little bit of a point. And he said it with so much conviction that people started to believe him. He spoke to the beliefs and fears of others and made them agree with him. Unfortunately, for as bad as a person as Thanos is, as unrealistic as the fantasy of wiping out the universe is, for no other reason than that the story is fictional, the method he used of instilling fear is something that humans have been doing forever. This is a long one. Let's do the horchata again. I don't know if you've ever had horchata, but this shit slaps. Throughout history, stories have been used for many different purposes, and there is no end to the philosophical literature covering stories and why we love telling them so much. It is often the arrogance of the storyteller to believe that stories are what make humans unique as a species. As a storyteller myself, I am biased, but I tend to agree. Our creativity mixed with our language and our intelligence is a very unique bunch of qualities we have access to. We love telling stories, mostly, and this is putting it simply, to connect with other people. Our avenue for connection, our goals, what we're trying to impart, all of that may change, but the story must have a teller and an audience. Sometimes we tell stories to ourselves, like with our own personal narratives about our personalities and lives, and to justify ourselves and construct our self-image. Of course, another part of human nature is our Jungian shadow, the dark subconscious that is our capacity to lie, to be cruel to others and to ourselves. This shadow can infect our stories, bringing forth slight implicit biases to full-on bigoted propaganda. Intentional or not, stories are ultimately dictated by the writer and influenced by the reteller. And our modern-day morals are not explicitly the same as they were even 30 years ago. Going back thousands of years, you will find many examples where the villain is more often than not coded to be, if not outright, some person that the writer or society itself deems as part of an undesirable group. This tribalism has affected every minority of race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, basically everyone under the sun besides a cisgender straight white man. Of course, this does not mean that cisgender straight white men have not been villains at all. In fact, a lot of villains are that specifically. But the difference is that these villains are villains because of the merits of their ideas, beliefs, plans, and actions, and there are very few villains that are explicitly portrayed as villainous or evil simply because they were born a cisgender straight white man. See, this is where this gets more complicated, and I have redone this part of the video a couple of times now because there is not a lot of explicit examples that are really to my liking for this section, because a lot of these require me to make assumptions and call-outs on things that for groups that I am not a part of, and honestly individual character breakdowns and author takes and things in modern media by people more qualified and honestly more experienced are going to serve this section better than just me, some 21-year-old in his room who is just making this video because he likes stories and wants to make a point, vaguely. When we talk about the history of villains, though, there is a stereotypical lens, at least in the last Hollywood era of film and TV, that is undeniably very clear. Throughout history, I'm sure there are a lot of examples of just people having a lot of ideas about what was okay and what was not, and that just being a blanket society thing. Like, you hear a lot of things about Greek heroes, like, and I'm sure I will put examples on screen now, or some Roman stories or something along those lines, that a lot of characters in general, not just villains explicitly, because sometimes villains are just straight up monsters and, you know, there's just not much to do about a guy with 15 snake heads, you know? It kind of gets difficult, especially throughout history, where it's very clear to point out and it's a general trend, but the specific examples are either too numerous to list in this video or very much just like a, hey, that's like kind of doesn't super affect the story. It's just a reinforcing idea in terms of what that society thought about a specific group. And that is technically, and I want to point out and be very clear, that is the point of these types of mistakes in terms of writing, in terms of the reinforcing of discriminatory ideas and stereotypes. It's that it's not supposed to be explicit. If it was supposed to be explicit, those people probably wouldn't be seeing those pieces of media and probably wouldn't be on the internet right now. Just saying. It's hard to categorize things that are under blankets of stereotypes and discrimination that's not meant to be sussed out, because the systems and people in place who are doing that discrimination don't want to be seen as evil themselves. They don't want to have the association of being that type of person, because generally speaking, most people are not like that, or at least they're not explicitly like that. Everyone has implicit biases, sure, but a lot of people aren't explicitly racist. A lot of people aren't explicitly that way. There are also different ways in which you can be. There is interpersonal prejudice. There is the oppression through an institution. There is a lot of ways in which this kind of discrimination can be expressed. And so you have a lot of examples that are nebulous, hard to define, and that's part of the plight. And I want to be very clear here, it's by design. If people wanted to do it explicitly and be caught, they would have. And the only reason people don't want to be caught is because on some level they know that it's wrong, one, or two, there are in fact repercussions for that, at least in modern times, generally speaking. Of course, you have worse examples over time, and in the past, especially if you go back towards probably 1930s with the, let's say, the Hays Code, which I will put that part of the video in right here. It was a self-imposed list of restrictions on the movie industry and was a code for what could and could not appear in your movie. It includes some more objective moral boundaries, which I cannot say on YouTube without potentially getting demonetized or having this video be taken down, but generally, the code was as follows. Number 1. No movie should lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. So basically, the main character cannot be a villain. Simple enough. Number 2. Correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. And number 3. Law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. This code was heavily enforced basically until 1968, and no doubt did irreparable damage to the minority representation in film and in the general consciousness. If you wanted to show certain things, you either outright couldn't or could only portray a villain with these traits, which means, for our villains, a lot of them are harmful and bigoted depictions of these groups, if not simply stereotypical, one-note caricatures of their real-life counterparts. In a discussion about villains and evil and the way that our morals are often shaped by society, it is important to remember that what we associate with evil is not always tied to any morally reprehensible act, but rather the product of hate and ignorance. I don't know how clear I have to be, so I will say this once and only once. The bigotry and biases of the writer should not and should never have been any basis for a villain or their villainous traits. People are not evil because they were born a certain way. Stop writing villains, or any characters for that matter, from this frame of mind. Challenge yourself and your biases and try to understand others before you portray them as evil.
So that was fucking cringe, right?
Of course, no one who is actually bigoted is going to change their mind because some fucking kid on YouTube told them that that was wrong. Like, they obviously either one, don't care, or two, know it's wrong and are going to continue to do that. I didn't do that because it was a good idea. I did that because, self-deprecating humor aside, I'm a philosophical bitch and I just like to make feel-good shit sound good, and that's fine. But do you see that in a video like this, ultimately this video is a little pointless? The point about the Hays Code is that it is explicitly saying that you are not allowed to make these people seem like they can be good. You can depict them, you can be explicit about how bad they are, but blanket term, we as an institution, as a system of media, we are saying these people do not get to be good because they're not like us. And even if they were like them, it's so deep rooted into the narrative of the world, into the narrative of the media that has been around. It makes it hard to stop. It makes it hard for those people to be better, because conforming to the preconceived ideas is survival. If you're more interested, look up people who are of those minorities talking about those struggles that they face, and you will get a more detailed and probably better executed than I could ever do on those topics. I'm saying all of this to say that the depictions of certain topics, of certain groups of people, and portraying them as evil are inherently going to be hard to talk about and hard to define. The too long didn't watch portion is that people suck and have sucked for a very long time and have put traits they don't like and they deem as not of them and things they should fear or hate, and others should as well, have been depicted as a version of evil. I mean, you also hear about it in everyday life. You don't have to be the villain of a fictional story. You are the villain of the socio-economic, political story of America. You hear it about in legislation, how in the gender bathroom bill in my own state, North Carolina, that is a story about people being portrayed as villains. Do you understand what I'm trying to impart to you? Just because the story is fictional doesn't make it any less harmful. And the sooner that we have these discussions, the sooner that all of us can, one, do representation better, which for all walks of life, generally a good thing, I would say. And also, we can have a more honest conversation about how we, in our own lives, can improve our neighbors' lives. How we can better treat them in our institutions, in our relationships, friendships, in the media. And hopefully those small changes every day can and will have an impact. I'm not saying that they will. I'm not saying that that's the solution. Again, I haven't even made an objective moral claim in this video. I just wanted to talk about this because I find the discussion important to have. It is difficult to me to impart this knowledge into somebody who doesn't exactly get or hasn't seen what I have seen or experienced what I have experienced. And as much as I call myself a storyteller, there are probably better ways of telling this story. In fact, I am sure there are better ways of telling this video's story. But I just find villains and how we talk about them and why we're fascinated with them so much so interesting. And to be able to share that feeling, that air of, oh my god, you love villains too. And now here is a campy, feel-good, uplifting message and conclusion after the fact. I do understand that I was never going to solve anything in this video, that anything I could have said would have been unoriginal, but I still made it, and I still said it anyway, because this would be no less authentic in the way that I wanted to say these things. So, please enjoy the end of the video. Editing Zuko, out. Villains are complex and have a storied history that go back thousands of years. Our perceptions of what is moral and therefore what is evil has evolved and changed over many generations of storytellers. As we continue to live on and tell stories, we as storytellers have a responsibility to portray villains and people, in general, as nuanced, complex people with their own unique perspectives, and as an audience, we have responsibility to find the harmful portrayals and separate them from the good ones, and define our own collective morality. The evolution of language, of stories, of morals is a constant one, an ever-flowing stream of ideas from the voices of all types of people, both audience and storyteller. We all have a part to play in the betterment of humanity. Don't let real-life evils corrupt your mind or drain your soul. Life moves on, and it is up to us to set the course for the future. In a way, this video is sort of a story about how stories are made. My voice and the way I have told the story of the villain will perhaps influence somebody in some small way. My ripple in the stream of ideas may change the course of history and how stories are told. And I think that's really cool. So, fellow storytellers, fellow audience members, each of your voices matter. And even if your voice is small and fleeting, your droplet can still affect the river.